In the popular imagination, Vikings are often seen as fierce warriors, raiders with horned helmets, sailing across the seas in search of conquest. But while war and exploration were a significant part of Viking life, they actually spent most of their time at home in their villages. Daily life in a Viking village was shaped not just by survival, but by community, craftsmanship, and tradition. These settlements, nestled in the fjords of Norway, the forests of Sweden, or the plains of Denmark, were vibrant, self-sustaining communities where family and farming were at the heart of everything. A typical Viking village was small, usually home to just a few dozen families. Houses were built close together for warmth and protection, forming a tight-knit community. At the center was the longhouse, a large wooden building with a turf roof and one main room. This is where families ate, slept, worked, and gathered. The longhouse was heated by a central hearth, which provided both warmth and a place to cook meals. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the scents of stew, wool, and leather. The Vikings lived by the rhythms of nature. Each day began at sunrise and ended at dusk. Most villagers were farmers, and their days were filled with hard physical labor. Men plowed the fields using ox-drawn wooden plows, sowed seeds, and harvested barley, rye, oats, and vegetables like onions, beans, and cabbage. Women tended gardens, cared for livestock, and preserved food through smoking, drying, and fermenting. Children helped where they could, collecting eggs, carrying firewood, or scaring away birds from the crops. Despite the hard work, Viking farms were productive. Cows, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens provided milk, meat, wool, and eggs. Fishing and hunting supplemented their diet. The seas and rivers offered cod, herring, and salmon, while the forests were home to deer, boar, and wild berries. Nothing was wasted. Bones became tools, hides were turned into clothing, and even the fat was used to make candles or soap. Craftsmanship was highly valued in Viking society. Many villagers were skilled artisans, working as blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, or leather workers. Blacksmiths forged iron into weapons, tools, and nails. Carpenters built boats, wagons, and furniture. Women spun wool from sheep, dyed it with natural pigments, and wove it into warm, colorful cloth. These goods were used at home or traded at local markets. Trade was vital, and even small villages often had access to imported goods like glass beads, silk, and spices, brought in through the Vikings' vast trade networks that reached as far as Byzantium in the Middle East. Family and kinship were the backbone of Viking life. Households were multi-generational, with grandparents, parents, and children living under the same roof. Everyone had roles and responsibilities. Men often went away on expeditions, whether for trade, war, or exploration, while women managed the homestead. Viking women had more freedom and respect than in many other medieval societies. They could own land, inherit property, and run businesses. In the man's absence, the woman of the house was in charge, and her authority was recognized by the community. Social life in a Viking village revolved around gatherings and celebrations. Feasts were held to mark the changing seasons, religious festivals, marriages, and successful harvests. These events were filled with music, storytelling, games, and food. Mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink, flowed freely, and skalds, Viking poets, recited epic sagas about gods, heroes, and ancestors. These oral traditions kept history alive and passed down cultural values to younger generations. Religion also played a major role in everyday life. Before the arrival of Christianity, the Vikings followed Norse paganism. They believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Shrines and sacred groves dotted the landscape, and villagers made offerings of food, weapons, or jewelry to gain favor or protection. Runes, carved into wood or stone, were used for magic, communication, and marking graves. Religious leaders known as Gothis oversaw rituals and ceremonies which were usually held outdoors or at home rather than in temples. Education in Viking villages was informal. Children learned by doing, through observation and participation. Boys learned farming, hunting, woodworking, and sailing from their fathers and uncles. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and managing the household from their mothers. There were no schools in the traditional sense, but knowledge of runes, mythology, and lore was passed down orally. Justice in Viking villages was enforced through community-based systems. If someone committed a crime, they could be fined, exiled, or, in serious cases, killed. Most disputes were settled at the local assembly, called the Thing. Here, free men gathered to make laws, resolve disputes, and judge crimes. The Thing was a democratic institution, and every free man had a voice. It was a place not only of justice, but also of social connection. Clothing in Viking villages was practical but well made. Men wore tunics, trousers, and cloaks fastened with brooches. Women wore long dresses over underdresses, often with aprons held by metal clasps, called tortoise brooches. Wool and linen were the most common materials, and wealthier individuals might decorate their clothes with embroidery, beads, or silver thread. Footwear was made from leather and designed to endure the rugged terrain. As for hygiene, the Vikings were cleaner than many of their European contemporaries. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, ear picks, and razors in Viking graves, showing that grooming was important. Villagers bathed in rivers or used steam baths when available. Cleanliness and neatness were signs of pride and status, and they took care of their appearance, especially before feasts or journeys. Seasons shaped the entire rhythm of life. Spring was a time for planting and mending. Summer was busy with farming, trade, and sometimes raiding. Autumn was the harvest season, filled with preparation for the harsh winter ahead. Winter was the quietest time. Snow blanketed the villages, and families stayed indoors, telling stories, crafting tools, and repairing clothes. It was also a time of reflection and celebration, marked by festivals like Yule, which included feasting, gift-giving, and honoring the gods. Children in Viking villages played games that mimicked adult life. Boys practiced with wooden swords and bows, preparing for the warrior path, while girls learned the skills needed to run a household. Both played board games like Hnefatafl, a strategic war game that reveals just how seriously Vikings took planning and tactics, even in play. These games were more than entertainment. They were training for adult roles in a society that valued strength, intelligence, and honor. Communication between villages was frequent, especially through trade and seasonal gatherings. Vikings were excellent shipbuilders, and even inland villages often had access to rivers or coastal routes. These waterways were the highways of the Viking world, connecting remote communities to larger trade hubs. Goods, ideas, and news traveled by ship, carried by merchants, warriors, and adventurers. Death was an accepted part of life in Viking culture. Funerals were both solemn and celebratory. Depending on the person's status, they might be buried in a simple grave with a few tools and ornaments, or given a full ship burial, complete with weapons, valuables, and even sacrificed animals or slaves. The belief in the afterlife was strong. Whether destined for Valhalla, hell, or another realm, the dead were seen as continuing their journey in another world. While Viking villages were rooted in tradition, they were not static. Over time, as Christianity spread, many pagan practices faded or blended with new beliefs. Churches replaced shrines, and Latin script began to replace runes. Still, the core of village life, family, hard work, honor, and resilience, remained. In the end, life in a Viking village was about far more than war and conquest. It was about growing food, raising families, honoring the gods, and surviving in a harsh but beautiful land. Behind every Viking warrior was a community that supported, sustained, and shaped them. These villages were the heart of the Viking world, places where stories began and where generations were raised to live boldly, explore bravely, and remember their roots. Thanks for watching. On our channel, you'll find more in-depth stories about Vikings life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments below. See you in the next video.